next speaker, I'm just going to mention their title because she's going to be introduced by my partner here, Darnell Smith, because she's going to also speak after the lunch hour, But I'd like to introduce Ruth B. Yesner, and Ruth B. is going to introduce a panel. It'll be moderated. It's called the City Panel, the Engaged Citizen, and how municipalities can effectively engage community members. So with that, Ruth B., please come to the stage and welcome. Thank you.
So thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm actually going to ask the panelists to come up. We're going to tighten our panel a little bit so we get back on track for time. So if we could have our panelists come up, and we'll introduce them while they're on stage, and I'll give a brief introduction to our panel today. So the exciting thing about this panel is we have an amazing representation of different viewpoints from a municipality. So we have a mayor, welcome. We have an assistant city manager, Tansy, welcome. We have a CIO, hello. And we have a council member. So we sort of have the perfect ecosystem to get a lot of different perspectives today from the point of the municipality in terms of how they're looking at community engagement. And so I wanted to just I'm going to make a few remarks, and then we're going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask them a few questions after they introduce themselves. And then we're actually, because this is a community engagement panel, we're going to have 5 minutes for questions from the audience, so we can actually have some engagement. So as you're listening, be thinking of some questions that you have that you can ask this esteemed panel. So one of the things I think is really interesting about smart cities is we tend to focus, and I think one of the panelists speakers was talking about this earlier about responsive cities. And one of the ideas is when you're looking at the smart city, how are we doing things differently? And how are we using innovation and technology to change the lives of people? And what's really important is this aspect of community engagement. Because you have to understand what your community and all its different sectors and different community subgroups, what they actually want and what they're prioritizing, so you can effectively serve them. And 2, you're actually probably trying to change their attitudes and behaviors in some ways. So when we talk about traffic and energy management and all those things, that does not get changed because you put a sensor and necessarily reroute traffic. That can help alleviate some of these things. But what really is going to alleviate it is if the community is engaged with you and agrees that they're going to have some priorities to shift to walking or to biking or to use some other modes in their journeys, and that's what's going to effectively get some cars off the street. Right? So a key point of smart cities is not just the technology, but how you use the community to help you change the quality of life and what's happening in terms of some of your challenges within the city environment. So that's really the framework of how we're looking at community engagement today. So with that, I'm going to start. You guys can take a few minutes and introduce yourself and your view on community engagement.
Thank you. Well, we're not
Can we hear you?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, there we go.
Good afternoon. I'm Pam Heminger from the town of Chapel Hill, where we pride ourselves on lots of community engagement. We say that out of 100 people in Chapel Hill, you'll get 125 opinions. So, and we have a very well-educated community and people who want to be involved, and we've done a lot of things in working with them to figure out the best ways to communicate with citizens so that they interact with us and to communicate back out things that are going on that they might not know about. We lost our local paper a couple of years ago, so it's been an even more interesting and challenging way to communicate with folks, and we've done the normal things that you think of with a really updated website with lots of interactivity, a call center that they can call and ask questions during emergencies and things like that. We post that out there on the radio, social media, Facebook, all those kinds of things, and yet still we weren't reaching as many people to tell them that things are going on. So during our water crisis almost 2 years ago, when people had forgotten to update their phone numbers with OWASA, such that they no longer had a landline and they didn't get the phone call that we had a water crisis, people were approaching me everywhere and fussing at me. I noticed, I didn't know, how could I have known? And I tried to start defending by saying all the things we did, but then I stopped and said, well, let me listen and figure out how they would have gotten the information. And it was fascinating to find out that people counted the overall response, and this came out in our survey too. Our overall response was, I believe things on my neighborhood listserv. Okay, I'm not on your neighborhood listserv. So we started a neighborhood liaison program where we invited the public to recommend somebody from their neighborhood or a volunteer who would be the receiver of information on important things going on in our town. And we have those logged, and we have lots of neighborhoods, so we don't have them all yet, but that is one way. We send the information to that individual, the liaison, and they decide what they put on their listserv, when, how, or if it's pertinent to their particular neighborhood. That's been hugely successful as far as engaging people on things that interest them. We have the weekly newsletter, we have a Citizens Academy, and we actually do a third grader field trip to Town Hall and run a mock meeting. We get a lot of response from that too. There's the thing that's been the most effective for citizens wanting to engage back with us, though, has been the see, click, fix. People love to send you the picture of the thing going on, and actually it's very helpful. It's very efficient. We can see something and already know what kind of equipment needs to go out there, or which department we need to send when they send those pictures in, and it's very helpful. And then they can track it themselves. So those are some of the things we do. We've done a really big push this year, though, on something called building integrated communities. We've been reaching out to our non-native English speakers and other parts of our community who aren't from our area to talk with them and do surveys at the library, the senior center, and places we know they are, to ask them how we could do a better job communicating with them. And that's been really effective and helpful, and we've had translators available for those conversations, and it's made a huge improvement in how we interact.
That's great. Thank you, Mayor. I just want to summarize a few things that I think are really interesting that you pointed out. First of all, in a time of crisis with the water crisis, you stopped and you sort of listened to the key themes that were happening. I think that's the key point amidst all the complaints. Sometimes it's very hard to stop and listen. And I think this is and you pulled out this brilliant nugget of the listserv, which I know I'm on my neighborhood listserv, so I do listen. I find out a lot of news from there, so I think that's and the other thing just to point out, which I personally think is really important as well, is this a programmatic approach where you have a liaison officer and there's sort of a planning around community engagement that you started to do more proactively. That's great. Thank you. Tansy.
Hi, I'm Tansy Hayward. I'm one of 3 assistant city managers here in Raleigh. We've got a lot of Raleigh folks in the crowd, so I'm going to recognize a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is the good work of Raleigh as our employees in this room and their good work. So I've been in local government in different capacities for just about 20 years now. Started in the Midwest and Olathe, Kansas, Des Moines, Iowa. Before coming to Raleigh, I was in Tacoma, Washington, and it's interesting, even over what's been a pretty short career, is the expectations and the trends around community engagement have changed quite a lot in that period of time. And I think in a few ways. One, I think ultimately cities have always done meetings. I think it's been a little bit of what does that engagement look like, how active or how passive is that engagement, and I think the expectation of citizens over time has been for a more active kind of participation with our local governments. The other piece is, along with the values of engagement, is really just a different expectation in terms of transparency. And I think a lot of engagement used to be kind of point in time. So you were doing a big project or you were considering a big policy, and they were very transactional points of engagement, where I think now there's much more of an expectation that engaging with with our communities is much more integrated into the way that we do business on a much more ongoing standpoint. And I think the other piece is really just recognizing in a different way the kinds of skill sets and strategies that go behind citizen engagement, a much more intentional focus on the way that we're going to interact with our communities and what that looks like. And I think along with that is much more of an expectation, both in terms of us as professionals and I think the elected officials that we serve, is that we're more intentional in making sure that we're reaching all of our communities. And so I think at the point that we have not been as intentional in the past, we haven't made sure that all voices in our communities were represented and that the decisions that we were making were considerate of underrepresented individuals in our community, whether that's sexual orientation or race or socioeconomic conditions. And so I think now cities also are adding that layer in terms of being quite intentional with the way that they're building their engagement strategies. And those are certainly, in terms of Raleigh, things that we talk about and think a lot about.
That's great, thank you. So it's interesting, and we're going to talk about this later, so you set us up for some good questions later in terms of the changing expectations of citizens and how you adapt to that. And I think you guys are a great panel to sort of talk about the realities of this. And it's true, they want more transparency, they want more engagement, and they want engagement in different ways, which is not going to a transportation board meeting and getting on an agenda and listening to everyone else complain, and often the same people over and over again. So I think that's great points. Thank you so much. Nicole. Are you on?
Okay. I'm not sure there's much left to say at this point. I would rather be in the first slot than the third. And I just really, so I've been in Cary for 3 years, and I want to just kind of piggyback a little bit on what my colleagues have talked about. And it really is about thinking about the different channels of communication. So all of us would like to receive and engage in different ways. And so I think for us, it's really about figuring out how to do that so that we can reach as many people as possible. I think that's the biggest challenge that we're all facing, is how do we do that, make sure that everyone feels connected and engaged with their community? What are the channels to do that, and how do we make sure that we're reaching everyone?
Thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Halloween. I got my Halloween socks on today. My name is Steve Rao. I serve as a senior member of the Town Council, City Council in Morrisville. I was Mayor Pro Tem for the last 2 years, and I just got sworn in last year to my third term. And I'm also a business development executive at Alphanumeric Systems, so I wear a different hat than many elected officials, that from the time I get up in the morning till when I get home at night, if I'm on in a city council meeting, I'm around innovation and technology almost all of the day. And so I first of all thank Darnell Smith and all of the great leaders here and the entrepreneurs that are working to create a great ecosystem. Our brand in Morrisville is called Live Connected, Live Well. And one of the jobs I'm working with Mayor Cawley and our council is to make sure that we're also playing catch up with many of the great cities like Raleigh and Cary, in terms of how they're leveraging data and analytics and smart cities. So we want to use technology to better connect our citizens. I got a little depressed when I looked at the questions before I came today, because I can't be as great as Nicole or the City of Raleigh, but my football analogy would be that it was third and long, but the good news is that we are hiring a CIO in Morrisville based on my recommendation that will be completely focused on the strategic direction for the town. And I think that's important because we've gone from third and long to third and short. And now what I want my council to do, along with the mayor, is to get a ball in the end zone so we can have many of these things like open data, smart cities, sensor technology. So if you have ideas, I'll close out with, I love to speak in metaphors, as you probably already noticed, but one of the perspectives I bring is how important regionalism is to the state of North Carolina in terms of how we accelerate job creation and how effective government services can be delivered to citizens. The analogy I would have is that if you're on a highway, I-40, it's nice that we have more than a few exits on the highway to get to where we want to go in the great state of North Carolina. And I think most of the innovation is occurring in the larger cities like Raleigh, Cary, Durham, Charlotte. But we need to really make sure that we're scaling this innovation around Wake County, around the Triangle region, and along North Carolina, because the innovation's occurring so fast. And I've even told Governor Cooper that, we've got to do more to make sure that all of North Carolina catches up. So, thank you.
That's great. Thank you. And I think you offer a really interesting perspective if you aren't doing some of these things, because I think you can provide a reality check saying, that seems hard for my town or city, or that doesn't seem realistic, because I think that's what we do find, is there are some cities sort of leapfrogging ahead, and it feels really daunting for maybe smaller cities or other cities to catch up. But there are some really concrete steps that I think you can take, so maybe we can talk about those again today as well. Okay, so we have a couple questions. I think you actually started talking about this a little bit, so maybe this is a quick type of question. But one of the things we were thinking about when we talk about community engagement is what specifically, because we have this diverse panel, what you think your specific role has to play in terms of moving community engagement ahead. So this is a question to really talk from your perspective about what you bring in your city, in your role.
So from the politician's point of view, it's to make sure that we have a welcoming and open attitude towards listening to folks, and to make that be part of our council meetings, part of our presentation out there, and going out into the community. That is part of our job. I know our staffs go out to the community as well, but it's important that the politicians go out and hear from community. And I call it reaching into community and going to the places where they are. We have a significant Chinese population in our community, and they have Chinese school on Saturdays. So I have gone there to talk to them and told them that I was coming, and we could talk about things going on in the town. So those are the kinds of things that politicians can help do. Meanwhile, our staff is out there doing the building integrated communities. They're also out there. Our survey, we're doing our Charting Our Future survey, but we're wanting to make sure the message is out there. So I guess it's mostly the messaging and showing up and being open and welcome to hearing that input, that we want everyone to fill out the survey. We don't care if you're a resident or what your status is. We want to hear from you if you're a part of our community. And a lot of our communities have people in them that sleep there and get up every morning and go elsewhere to one of our other communities to work. And then we have a lot of people that come into our community during the day that don't sleep there. And we want to find out what their opinions are as well. So you have to make that known, that you are welcome and open to hearing all of it from everyone. And then we have a big university, and we have to make sure that's part of our community engagement as well. So I think it's setting the tone, helping staff know that that's the goals that the council and the mayors want to have, and then working with your staff to figure out the best ways to do that.
To add on that, and the greatest thing about the city manager's office generally in terms of the job, it's never quite the same job, depending on the day. Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably true for everybody at the table. I think about this in kind of three chunks, and certainly as in the manager's office, we're partially helping to enable those in our organization to have the tools they need to be successful. We're trying to facilitate to ensure that our community is aligned with our organization, and partially through the lens of the council. But that plays out in kind of three different ways when I was thinking about the audience here, and that is, how are we establishing policies and ensuring that those policies are administratively feasible and meet the community's needs and the council's objectives. And that plays out in a lot of ways. Technology can help in trying to anticipate or model or illustrate the impact of a policy in terms of how does that play out in the real world. Clearly, in terms of our capital planning and our capital investments, technology has been a really significant part of that for a long time, and maybe from an engagement perspective has probably been where some of our systems have matured for the longest in terms of capital planning and visualization and GIS and some of that more static piece. But I think where we're really starting to stretch and learn is how does technology make us be operationally smarter, and how do we pull engagement in there? And I think back to that question of equity, is we have traditionally relied on a lot of reactive models, and so those individuals with the most power and influence in a community largely have had their needs better met. And I think with data and analytics and better modeling and really applying data and thinking about how what the consequences of our prioritization and how we apply data helps us to make sure that the way that we operate our services meets everybody's needs more equitably. So I think that's kind of the opportunity that the smart cities really starts to plug into more. How are we bringing the community and community data into the everyday decisions that we're making around deploying resources?
That's great. So not surprisingly, the city manager side has to do with money and operations and feasibility, but really important. I think it was a really important nugget that you said that some of your IT or tools may be the most outdated around the community engagement piece. So I think that's, an interesting point.
So I think we touched upon it a little bit earlier in talking about, we know that the needs of our community have changed, right? And the demand is higher for engagement, whether it's in the transparency or in tools. And in Cary, we've really looked at that combination of figuring out what the messaging is going to be and how that's going to work. So we are actually moving our communication staff, so our traditional PIO and our marketing staff will now be part of IT, because really communication's one and the same, right? So if we look, for example, on our smartphones, it's a communication tool, but it's also technology. So I think for us, it's really going to help us think about how we engage differently, maybe a little bit smarter, think about the messaging, like Tansy had said, and making sure it's on point and we're not overloading, and what are new mechanisms to engage and connect our community, whether it's through technology and smart IoT devices, whether it's the data, but also combining that with the brain power of the folks that are really good at communication.
It's interesting, too, because I think there's this app overload, too, right? I mean, there can be tons and tons of information and apps that cities can put out for various, very specific things that are really good tools for engagement, but, I mean, maybe you have to sort of rationalize and have that view in terms of what can be used. So excellent point.
Well, first of all, I'll answer the question of what I do in my role as the council. So, I mean, since I was elected in 2011, I've tried to bring a perspective as someone in the technology industry on what Morrisville could do. So my first 5 years of office was spent a lot bringing ideas on how do we have better DR strategies? How do we have software as a service purchases rather than buying licenses? We did a network assessment. And then we also did a cybersecurity assessment. So all of these things were things that the administration took very seriously when we had a new manager come in, Martha Page, who's the town manager. So we got all of that done. And now the challenge has been, how do I educate the council and the administration on how we can leverage technology, not for what I call the Vince Lombardi blocking and tackling, which is how many servers, how many commuters, but how do we deploy better technology to better connect citizens to Morrisville from a transparency perspective? How do we enable entrepreneurs to come with great ideas that the town can use? Because in any organization, if you're in the corporate world or in the city, you cannot grow your organization if you're not connected to innovation. I think it's very important to understand that connecting to our entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we have actually a company here today, Vivek Yadav from M-Connect, and we'll probably talk a little later about kind of things, but we had an entrepreneurship program that I helped start many years ago, and he came through that program, and it's basically, he was an entrepreneur who saw a problem, and the problem was, how do I get individuals in the town to connect everything going on in Morrisville on your device? So he aggregated data from all of our social media, Twitter, and he started a company called M-Connect, and he now sells that on the App Store. The beautiful news is that he's now in the finals of the NC Datapalooza on November 8th, and he's actually got a lot of customers now that are using his tool. So it's a perfect example, and if you're an entrepreneur and you have an idea, I want you to meet me during my office hours, which I have every Friday at noon. And almost every office hour in the last year has been from an entrepreneur who's developed a civic-based application. So the hardest part of my job is, I wish I could write a pamphlet called Smart City for Dummies, not to put my colleagues down, but to simplify it for them to understand how this is about solving problems, providing efficiencies, and growing jobs in the new economy. Thank you.
So really interesting point about community engagement, which is it's not just about the residents, right? So you actually are thinking about the business community, the nonprofits, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the startups. So you've got a lot of different sectors. So really good point to bring in the fact that you're not just engaging residents and you're not just engaging citizens. We used to call it citizen engagement, But really, you got a lot of people who are visitors or other things.
And
Mayor.
it's changed so much too. You talk about the short time. Citizens don't want to read 4 pages about something.
Right.
They want a sound bite. They want a video. So we do a
Yes.
lot of video clips, post them on Facebook. At the
Yes.
beginning of every one of our council meetings, we have a video celebrating successes. We try to send out Snapchat stuff. I mean, it's amazing how you're trying to communicate, but they don't want to read all. We do dashboards now,
Yep.
and they can click further in. But it's you want to make it simple, and that's what you're trying to say. Make
Yep.
it simple for people to engage,
Yep.
and give them the way they want to receive it, not the way we want to spew it, if that makes any
Yeah,
sense.
that's great. Yeah, we call that at IDC snackable content, because really that's what people want, is a little, like a little
content.
filling, sustaining, like energy bar, not a big sit-down 3-course meal of information.
Yeah.
Nicole, were you gonna?
I mean, for us, one of the ways I think most of people know here that we've actually turned our campus into a living lab. So we work with our community partners and companies that have moved into the area, as well as some of the nonprofits around the region, to really use the lab. Our campus basically represents a city, just on a town on a smaller scale, to come in and test out IoT solutions so that we can evaluate them before we would deploy them. But it also lets citizens come in and sort of touch and feel, right? See what a parking sensor looks like. We actually have, IoT rodent traps, and the lighting and all sorts of things. So I think it brings that connection also into the community where they can see it and touch it before we would ever deploy it.
That's great. So we only have a couple minutes left before I'm going to open it up to questions. So we're going to skip over a bunch of the questions that I was hoping to ask, which is really sad. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to combine a question, which is, and maybe we can just go down the road and be as concrete as possible. I think the issue of community engagement is really, how do you reach diverse groups? So I would really love one lesson learned from each of you. Either it could be a lesson of something that didn't work or something that did work, that you could really impart to the audience. And any other sort of specific challenges that you've come across that it might be helpful for the people in the audience to think about ahead of time if they're thinking about their own community engagement strategy. And then I think we'll have to open up for questions.
So the biggest lesson, go where they are. They're not coming to your council meeting. Go to the community center, go to the library, go to the Chinese school, go wherever it is, and take a translator with you if you know, or someone that's already have made that connection with someone in that community to be there with you, so that sort of builds a trust element, because just coming to speak doesn't really help. But going in and not just waiting for people to come to you, because we're scared, we're overly formal and overly scary.
That's great.
So that was going to be one of my lessons learned as well, but I will. For anybody that has been on the City of Raleigh's board docs document, I would encourage some concrete examples of that. We just did an update on our Dix Park planning process on Monday to our city council in a workshop, and there's a great PowerPoint there that talks about really the diverse engagement that we have utilized in that project, and a lot of that was using this meet people where they are strategy, and really bringing in some pretty unique technologies into that. So ultimately, because we can't have everybody in the park, we did take some VR headsets to festivals so people could imagine themselves in the park and give some feedback. To add on that is, I think, don't only engage when you have an agenda. So another really concrete example from Raleigh, our planning department really pushed on social media this idea of 100 meetings and 100 days, and did some of that was really targeted, but some of that was just, we're going to be in this area, come ask a planner. And that was about relationship and trust, because a lot of times we set a meeting with our agenda, with our objectives. And so I think really thinking about that engagement different. And the other is, I think about ways people can interact with you without interacting with you. So a good example, we had a very intensive greenway planning experience or plan, and I think everybody in Raleigh loves their greenways. One of the things that those of you that use our greenways probably don't know, we have some great visions for our greenways that we have to prioritize, and we have put sensors in bollards on our greenways to understand better the utilization patterns, so that we can start to prioritize where we're going to make investment and amenities in the greenway system. So we've already heard from the public what kind of enhancements they want to see in the greenways, and having that data from the sensors really helps us to build on that narrative and inform those decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're all probably doing most of the same things, and I think it's great to hear, and Tansy really said it right. It's both combining the use of technology, but it's always communicating, right, personally with the citizens, so to make sure we're out there. We also, I'm sure, like everybody else, have boards, so we have citizen boards that we will allow them to test technology out and get feedback from them, use them as actually test cases, right? Because they're the ones that are going to be using it. But also, I think, Tansy said it, whether it's sensor technology to gather information, but I think it is critical that we always think about that there is an actual user and that face-to-face time is equally as important. We don't ever want to lose that.
Thank you.
Yeah, most of what I said was going to be said, so I agree with everything that was said. And I think the PIO, combining the PIO role in our town with information technology, I agree with what Nicole said. I think we're working on that as well with some staff changes. I think that's a lesson learned that we've got to try to get better at that. I think also one lesson learned for me as a council member, but also for all of us is for example, the smart campus idea that Carrie has done a great job. I think we can do the same thing in Morrisville. If you're a company out there and you've got ideas, come to us. Let's find out the staff departments. We can pilot it in. Let's go make it work. Let's go solve a problem. Let's show the council, let's show the administration that we can do that. And the final thing is, how can we better solve problems? Our number one problem in Morrisville, if you've driven there at 8 in the morning or 5 in the evening, is congestion. And someone used the analogy today of roads being arteries and veins. I think it's time for a full vessel bypass in Morrisville, if I was a cardiologist. We have $300 million coming into our town from the state Department of Transportation, but still that's not enough. So I think we have to look at better as a council how we can leverage sensors and smart technologies to take traffic off the road, providing better options for transit. One of my colleagues, Councilmember Garamella, grew up in Mumbai, India, and he always comments that he was able to get a bus and train every 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. So just bringing these things to awareness would be one. Thank you.
I actually just want to give a shout out to all of the other Triangle CIOs, because I think it's important for people to know, and I think, Steve, you talked about it a little bit, that we all do communicate with each other. So we really do understand the benefit of working together as a region, and understand that makes us stronger and that makes us smarter. We understand that there are not physical barriers, right, in the road when you drive from one place to another, and that's really important, especially with traffic lights, emergency management. We think of all those things. So we do work together. We think about these things because we really do want to make the Triangle the smartest place in the world.
Excellent. Well, I think it's good that you all kind of had the same opinion, because it makes it really easy for me to sort of summarize, I think, some key points and lessons learned from this panel, which was go where people are, whether that, and bring a translator if you need to. I think that's actually a really key point, including face-to-face time is always important. You can use interactive and interesting technologies to meet people where they are. You can go to them, which is, I think, the VR headsets and social media and streaming your council meetings does. Don't only engage when you have an agenda, so go just to engage and be out there and be part of the community. Always communicate, and I think let people touch and feel technology solutions to sort of continue engagement as part of education. So I'm hoping we can get 1 or 2 questions from our engaged audience in our 2 minutes that are left.
What are you, in your respective roles, doing to help city staff be able to innovate, but also work on ideas that ultimately may fail, but giving them the room and the opportunity to do that, especially in this political climate?
I can start. So we definitely do that. We've had internal hackathons, right, where we actually encourage more non-technical folks than technical, where we partner them up, where they can kind of test ideas out and build them out. In terms of really the smart cities, we have a committee that we have representation from every department in the organization because it touches everything and it's important that we all meet together. So I think we've provided lots of ways to do that. We're also moving towards a platform strategy, so we're really figuring out what those look like so that we're able to teach non-technical folks how to solve their own problems. In IT, we certainly don't want to be the roadblock. There's more work than any one department can take on, so we really are trying to teach people to help them move us forward.
That's great.
Yeah, it's a hard question because risk is an inherent part of us. And I think, in Raleigh, if you got a notice last week about a boil water advisory that didn't impact you, you'll know that the application of technology is not always perfect. Particularly, one of the benefits of emerging technologies or emerging projects pilots is that they have to move fast. And so I think we're trying to teach people good project management and kind of building the base of capacity. So we do a performance and analytics academy where we teach people about data analysis and project planning to help make them able to plan a project and try to support them with that. We are trying, in our strategic plan, one of our initiatives is around pilots. Sometimes just calling something a pilot gives people room and space to experiment and be clear about successes and failures. But certainly I think the other piece is when something doesn't work, being willing to take accountability and identify why something didn't work and what we're going to do to improve it as we move forward.
So technology is changing quickly and rapidly, faster than politicians can react. We count on our IT specialists in our department to help us understand what's going on and give us solutions for the future. Ours is here. He's wonderful. He's part of the management team, the cross-collaboration on our own management teams, but also the cross-collaboration with the university for us and the K-12 system and the business community, all working together that we do capture those wonderful ideas. And then it's probably a major part of each of our budgets for IT and information technology because we want to stay ahead and to keep moving forward because we do find those efficiencies really help out both in financially but also in the communications, and that takes a lot less time if you put it in, implemented it earlier. So we like trying new ideas. We have the open data portal. We're learning from that. We don't actually ever think everything's going to solve, the new thing isn't going to solve everything. So it's okay that things don't work just quite as right because it's moving so fast. You have time to jump at everything and try to figure it out. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Could I? Well,
Okay.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Sure. Oh, sure.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My question, I guess, has to do with raising expectations of the engaged citizen. Because I was particularly struck by, I think, the mayor from Chapel Hill. Like, you've got this incredibly educated base, and yet you yourself are finding, your team in a position where you're trying to deliver this so-called snackable content. And it's intriguing to me that we have folks who are interested in being a part of the process, participating, which is great. But, so many of these issues, they're not snackable issues, and so I think there's something to be said for, and I'm really interested in hearing from, the mayor from Chapel Hill and maybe Tansy, if you want to pipe in. Have you thought about this sort of conundrum of sorts, where you've got people who really want to dig in with you, but yet will only give you 2 seconds? Thank you.
It's a great question.
Well, it's a constant battle. I mean, it really is trying to get as much information out and in the snackable size, but then that reaching into community really is important. You have to make the time to go so you can have those deeper conversations and connect people to each other. I convene a lot of different groups in town, and it's worked well. I don't have all the answers, but they do. And they come to the table together, and we have good conversations, and I consider that one of the major parts of my job is bringing people together to have those discussions, whether it's in the recreation area, the business area, and people who are not in the public housing. We have a public housing meeting, and we have different ways to communicate, and I always stress that to folks, that face-to-face is not the only way. Emails, phone calls, Snappable, See, Click, Fix, all those ways to reach out, but it takes a lot of energy to sort of plan how to do all that, and again, though, I consider it a high priority, and so does our staff. We have a lot of staff that are engaged in the community and spend their weekend times at the mall talking to people. One mayor shared with us that they send out a popsicle truck into different neighborhoods to get people to fill out the survey. It attracts people's interest and their staff members with the popsicle to answer questions, to bring. So it's about going where people are and having those deeper conversations that lead to actually really better outcomes.
Go ahead.
I also think, for us, and I think others are building or have 311 systems, that the more information that we gather, right, so whether it gathers your social or what classes you have attended or your family, it becomes much more of a personalized communication tool with our community. So it provides an overall way for us to look at our community and our citizens in a much more personal way. So we'll know that you've had a conversation with someone about whatever issue, so that if someone's on the phone, they're more than happy to ask you about it. Was it resolved, right? Or, hey, saw that you signed up your kid for soccer. Well, did you know that USA has the women's team in town this weekend? Which, by the way, they do. So if you all want to go to a weight man. But I think it's really thinking about how do we connect and engage, but on that individual level as well.
The only thing I'll add to that is, I think, to answer your question about expectations, I think the expectation of any citizen should be to always remind your government that they should get out of their comfort zone. And when I say that, we often forget that, 20 years in Mooresville, we had briefing books this big, even a few years before I got elected, where they would bring them in. Then they went to a digitized copy, saved a lot of money. Then they started using email to communicate. Then recently we've been using social media and Twitter, using mConnect to connect with citizens. We're doing all of these things. We're streaming our meetings now. Those were things that at the time looked very hard, but the staff made those decisions, and the town of Mooresville is better for it. Now, what I need our directorates and our staff to do, and the citizens, is to come and say, okay, get out of your comfort zone. I was a college tennis player. Some of my best matches I won when I had to get out of my comfort zone and play a match with a shot that I didn't hit very well, because that's what got me to eventually win the match, right? So I think it's encouraging you through the engagement of come and tell us, what do you want? What do you expect? And we'll go and figure it out. Thank you.
Yeah, it was such a great question that I know everybody's hungry, but I have to grab it. And I hope you introduce yourself after this, because I'm going to be thinking about your question for maybe days. I think it's really an insightful question, because governments, we have dozens and dozens of lines of business that all have really nuanced and meaningful impacts on the community, and each decision is really significant. So it is hard to capture all of that in what's called, I love this term, snackable content. But I think if I could think about that a little bit, and if you're not with local government, I would pass a question back your way. And it's more that maybe that snackable content is an invitation. And it's an invitation to come into an ecosystem of lots of ways to get engaged. And so I think the question is that snackable content a friendly enough invitation that encourages you to be interested, to figure out where's that next point in that ecosystem, whether that's a CAC, or it's a civic club, or it's a board committee commission, or it's public hearings, or it's getting more familiar with how to use the city's whatever platform they're on for board agendas, to be able to follow that. And so I think the question for us really is, are we issuing those invitations in a way that piques your interest or helps you understand the impact to you and your community? And frankly, for most people in our community, does that in a meaningful way for you to step over whatever barriers there are for you to participate? Because being involved and engaged takes a lot of time and energy. And so, one, is that invitation warm enough? Is it meaningful enough? And do we lay out for you what that ecosystem looks like if you want to take that invitation and get more involved? So if there's advice that you can give to any of us individually about how we can make that roadmap more apparent in those invitations, I think that we all want to do that.
That's great. So unfortunately, we ran a little bit over. We didn't get to everything I was hoping, so I'm just going to mention 3 things that I think we should eventually talk about, or you should have another panel on, or there's things. One is, and I think Nicole mentioned it, which is the idea of personalization. So the fact that we can now use some of these technologies to really have a two-way personalized interaction with a multitude of residents or businesses, which is really interesting when you think of some of the implications of that. I think the other key thing is to think about the skill sets of the frontline staff. So everyone up here is kind of polished executives, and when you go down to people who maybe have been used to working without much interaction with the public, and suddenly they find themselves connected via an app or getting real-time feedback, what kind of skill sets and how do they need to think about new ways that their role might be changing, which I think is important. And then also thinking about community engagement as a program and how you manage it as a program within the city. And that was, another topic I was hoping to ask about. But anyway, I really want to thank this amazing panel. We got such a good sense of perspective. Really appreciate all your insights. So thank you very much. Okay.